What's going on, guys? Welcome to another YouTube video. Today we're doing another Remnant challenge, and this time it's going to be getting through the entirety of the game with exclusively melee damage. Now the first couple of things to note is that this will be my first ever melee run, which is really exciting for me. And the second thing to note is that the entirety of this game is not possible with exclusively melee because of the amount of flying enemies. So in order to make that work, we're going to have to quickly run and grab any sort of throwable melee before this starts, which I wind up choosing the Huntress's Spear for a variety of reasons. Namely because its precision damage is really good, and that'll come in clutch for a couple of different bosses. Also, this will be done on Apocalypse, as always, and my two classes that I've chosen for this run are both the Invader and the Challenger. But without further ado, let's get right into the video. Now the first thing to take note of is that I don't have a very large amount of experience with melee runs in general, so there will be a lot of scenarios where I just have to die until I learn the mechanics or the attack timings of specific enemies and bosses, and that'll just be how it is until I learn how to get good. The first dungeon we encounter on our playthrough is the Butcher's Quarters, which luckily is not too difficult of a dungeon. However, it is the first showcase of my lack of experience, where I just die to the same elite over and over and over until I eventually learn how to get through it. This is very similar to the secret mini-boss in the castle, underneath behind the painting, and it's the same case there as well, where we just gotta learn the mechanics and get good. Eventually we do make our way through this dungeon despite all of its annoyances, especially since the guys in this area catch themselves on fire, making it very difficult to actually get any meaningful hits off without taking damage in response. But we do make it through, and we get to the end of the dungeon where we have to either let this guy burn or we save him. Now typically by my rules I have to save him, because if you don't save him then you can just skip the fight, which we're not allowed to do. So we do the fight. And overall, it's not too difficult. The only thing that becomes a problem is the elite at the end. Now, this elite is very obnoxious for a variety of reasons. Reason number one, he likes to put this smoke cloud that makes it impossible to hit him for a little bit of time because you'll cough instead. Reason number two, getting in melee range damages you, if you're at the front at least, because those saw blades, if they hit you at all, they will do a lot of damage, and I think in some scenarios they will even bleed you by a lot. And number three, he's just got a lot of health. But it's not too difficult regardless, because this specific elite likes to take breaks. So we just wait for our opportunities to attack, and we're able to kill him. Now this next dungeon is the reason why I had to stop and go grab the Huntress's Spear so early into the run. The Bloat King is the boss of the Great Sewers, which is the next dungeon on our list, and he cannot be defeated by normal means. You have to use some sort of range damage to kill him, unfortunately, so we have to go grab a throwable melee. The melee I've chosen is the Huntress's Spear for a variety of reasons, such as its high precision damage and its longer melee range makes it very easy to stay at a distance while still dealing damage to our foes. And using this, we're able to quickly make our way to Bloat King. And Bloat King himself is not too hard of a boss. There are a couple of strategies we can implement to make it even easier as well. However, this boss is not too difficult, especially so early in the run. I also have quite a bit of experience with Losomn in general, so this doesn't cause me too many problems at all, and we're able to make it through it on our first try. Now our overworld encounter for this area is going to wind up being the Orphanage, which is amazing because it lets us grab recovery. And one of the main issues we're going to have this entire run is going to be stamina. Since a lot of enemies are going to be flying and the later stages of the bosses are going to be very difficult, we're going to be using a lot of our stamina just chucking spears at them. So anything that can help with our stamina is going to be very, very useful. Now when navigating the insane asylum, the only thing to take note of is Ripjaw in the Shed. He's just an enhanced version of the elites that we already meet out in the overworld. He did spawn with Shocking, which is going to be really annoying. But implementing the same strategies, such as just keeping our distance whenever we need to, and then getting in there whenever he puts his thing down for a rest, we're able to take him out without too many issues. We quickly talk to Nimue, who sends us to the next area, and then we quickly make our way to the Council Chambers. The Council Chambers is also quite an easy encounter. It's just a little romp through the forest, and then you're at the end where you go to a Shadow Realm, This second area was quite annoying if I'm being completely honest with you. It's very difficult to hit some of these flying enemies, especially those archers who love to try and dodge your attacks. But we make our way through, grab the dagger, present it as proof so that way we can complete this event, and we're able to move on. Next up is the Shattered Gallery, where we encounter the fire puzzle, and good to note is that the throwable spears are an adequate substitute for bullets. And we make our way to Magister Dullahan, which is one of the first bosses that we can actually melee. Now, fighting Magister Dullahan melee immediately brings up one big problem. I can't avoid the debuffs that he applies to you that will slowly drain you of health and eventually kill you. This will be one of the many times that I have to switch up my gear in order to actually beat a boss, and in this instance we use the Alchemy Stone, which is very good find for us because we're pretty much always poisoned, so the lifesteal is always in effect. With that problem taken care of, the next problem is just learning this guy's attacks. And boy does he have one really annoying one and one attack that doesn't matter. Now when you're fighting him melee, he does this long sweep attack that does massive damage and knocks you down. And the best way I found to avoid this is to just roll behind him whenever he's starting to do this attack. It's just way easier to roll past it than to try and perfect dodge it because it's such a slow and long reaching attack. The second one is a quick swipe with a lantern. Now since I can melee this boss normally, I wanted to use this as an opportunity to learn how to use melee in this game effectively. This fight kills me a lot. It takes me a long time to get used to the buttons and the feel of melee, but it's a very good thing that I decided to do this because this makes things easier for us down the road, and this goes along with getting me used to the way melee plays. This winds up being a very fun fight, honestly. It flipped it completely on its head how I typically fight these bosses, and I really enjoyed this. We eventually do learn his attacks, we play it safe, and we are able to take him down. Now before we can complete this world, we do need to do one more thing, and it's one of the side objectives that I forgot to complete. Originally I thought I failed and couldn't go back, but we did make our way back and are able to get to it. Now this side dungeon is super important because it gives us the Drakestone Pearl, which lets us regenerate stamina while melee attacking, and this is a ring that I used for the entire run, just straight up, just the entire run. Now I got caught off guard when this event happened, which is why I thought I failed, but we were able to go back and kill the elite in the dungeon to grab the ring, and then we're able to move on. Now we get to Nightweaver. Oh boy, Nightweaver. This boss is so annoying. Now the first phase of this fight is just it's so difficult to melee. She flies around all over the place and is constantly making it really difficult for you to even get close to her. And even when she is close to you, it's difficult to get any meaningful damage off, making this a slow, very dreary fight. To top it all off, she summons these beetles that blow up whenever you get too close to them, and they deal a bunch of damage. This fight is just the definition of a nightmare boss when you're trying to do melee only. The solution I found to the first phase problem is just A, being patient, and B, trying to get her to enter her alternate kill, because it stops her from summoning beetles in the first phase. Now she'll still summon beetles in the next phase anyways, but we have a strategy for dealing with that later as well. Now the main problem here is just damage in general. It's just damage. I do get a buddy of mine to help me out, and I'm able to go to his world and grab some good gear. Now in Remnant 2, you can travel to other worlds and you can get unique items from other people's vendors. So I quickly made a trip to his world to grab both the Marginalized Leaf and the Burden of the Destroyer. With these two trinkets in my hand, I was able to actually make it past phase 1, and phase 2 is significantly more easy to melee than phase 1. She gives you way more opportunities and she's way more aggressive, which also gives you even more opportunities. Now as I said, she does still spawn beetles, but the weird thing about the beetles in this version of the fight is that they don't actually deal damage until they completely spawn in. So if you hit them as they spawn, they'll die and deal no damage to you, negating the problem. Using these few tricks, I am able to beat this fight, but this was one of the first fights that actually made me take a break and have to come back to it later. But we managed to endure the suffering, we managed to learn the attacks, and we are able to finally beat this 15-minute long fight. Now there are still 2 more things we need to do before we actually complete Losomn, and I didn't actually realize that I forgot these objectives till much later, so I want to just quickly go over the fact that I did do these. All of the gear that I have at this point in time is a little higher than what I'm supposed to have. Now the first thing is that we forgot the Great Hall, where we have to fight the secret boss that I was talking about behind the painting. This actually isn't too bad of a problem because at this point in time I've got a bit more gear than I was supposed to have. Not technically against the rules to skip stuff and come back to it later, however, But after that, we are able to make it an easy clear. Then we go and do this other side area, which the whole purpose of this area is just to grab a cog for the bell tower, and then we go in bell tower and complete that bell tower, completing Losomn, and we're able to move on to the Labyrinth. Now the Labyrinth never changes, it's always the same. However, the thing that gives us the most problems in this run is the flying enemies, believe it or not. Anything that is just hard to consistently damage is just going to be obnoxious to really deal with, and that just winds up being flying enemies in this game. We do manage to make our way through and get to the first siege event, but this does take us a few tries to complete. Now, funnily enough, as soon as I'm able to get past the flying enemies, it's not too difficult of an event. However, for some reason, the elites that are just the giant rocks, their explosion radius is massive for some reason. But once I'm able to get through that part, the final elite isn't actually that difficult. I don't know if it's something to deal with my character or the positioning, but I was actually too close to the enemy so that the elite couldn't hit me, like, at all. None of his attacks were landing. So I just hit him until he dies, and that was that. I'll take it. Now the final challenge of the Labyrinth era is the Labyrinth Guardian. And this fight genuinely pissed me off. I don't typically have too much trouble with Labyrinth Sentinel. After the first couple of times you fight him, you're typically able to memorize his patterns. But I don't know if I was having an off day or what, but the combination of having to lead the projectiles, keep in mind both the positioning of the rocks and the little balls that they shoot at me, and the fact that sometimes I was just led into traps, led me to getting cornered a lot and killed a lot. The main issue was that I had to take time to get rid of some of the orbs that were following me because they would two-shot me and kill me, even with my armor. And I don't have the ability to toss spears very fast, so anytime I had to chuck a spear not at one of the weak spots was just another huge amount of time wasted. Eventually though, I am able to just completely memorize the patterns of each cube, so much so that there's probably a good chance that I'll never have problems with this boss again. But there's nothing more frustrating than being stuck on a moving boss who can only be damaged by small weak points with a projectile weapon that doesn't move very fast. This was obnoxious. We do manage to get through it, but I was not happy the entire time. With the Labyrinth completed, we make our way to Yisha, which doesn't have anything in particular too interesting happening until we make our way to the Root Nexus in the overworld. This fight is honestly really boring. I do it on my first try, although it is a little close. There's nothing too interesting, I just hit it until it dies. Fill it with enough holes with my spear that it probably should have died ages ago. But other than that, we quickly make our way to our first dungeon, Endara's End. Which is annoying because all the elites in this section suck to fight. You got one that you can only hit at a very specific moment in time, and you've got one that shoots grenades at you. We do manage to make our way through, but just barely. Now this isn't a boss dungeon, it's actually a puzzle dungeon, or I guess more qualified as a maze dungeon. And we have to go through the maze and fight this special elite And then this is also where you get the Krell throwing axe, which is another throwable melee that we could use if we wanted to, but I just stick with the spear. Now this is probably one of the funniest moments I've had in my game. I knew this was possible, but I didn't mean to do it when it happened. Headphone warning, by the way, I apologize.
Oh, that's it?
Okay, that's a... Oh man, okay, yeah, that's fair, yeah. But with that enemy out of the way, we are able to just quickly make our way to the next area, the Twisted Chantry. Now there is the coffin event that we do have to get through real fast. It's not too difficult, it's just a bunch of enemies in the water and then one elite at the end. Unfortunately, I'm not able to cheese him this time. He worked properly and I had to fight him. The fight's not too difficult, he's just another enhanced version of one of the elites you have to fight, and that elite in particular isn't too difficult because he's quite slow. The fight is a little chaotic because he has Enchanter, but we take care of him and we're able to move on to Legion. Now Legion in this challenge is even more difficult than normal, solely because I have such a short window to actually deal damage to him, and it's even shorter because I have to wind up my toss on top of the fact that I've got to make sure that the ads are kept in check. But thanks to a couple tricks that I learned, thanks to some commenters, I was able to make easy work of the bloaters for the most part, and the ability to use Juggernaut lets me take care of the other ads fairly quickly. I do die a few times just because the animation is such a long animation in terms of trying to toss the spear, and that I get caught in it every once in a while. But as long as you're patient, Legion isn't going to be able to cause you too many problems. It's just a matter of trying not to be too greedy with your damage. This fight is still annoying, but we do manage to get through it. Before we move on, I did want to quickly go over the fact that I pick up a very important ring called the Blood Jewel. This lets me bleed my targets whenever I use a charged melee attack, and since I'm using the Hunter's Spear, most of my range attacks are going to be charged melee attacks. This isn't too important, but it is something to take note of because it winds up being extremely useful in every fight going forward, since Regenerator will be a constant pain. Moving on to our next dungeon of this run is the Nameless Nest, where we first encounter the Twin Bandits, once again. Now, these guys are once again fairly annoying, since one of them spawned with Shocking, and the other one spawned with Enchanter, meaning that there's a lot of chaos going around and a lot to avoid. But just using the same strategy of taking them one at a time makes this a pretty simple fight, and we're able to move on shortly after that. Taking us to Mother Mind. Now, Mother Mind is a pretty interesting fight, honestly. I think it's a very fun fight, very cool fight. However, this fight is also very slow with the spear. Typically, you're able to damage through her pretty fast because her weak spot is pretty easy to hit. But even with the weak spot being able to be hit, this fight still takes us a considerable amount of time, and I do die a few times in the process. But with the bleed helping out a little bit, and with just some natural patience, we are eventually able to take her out. So far, these bosses have been getting steadily more difficult. So far, the primary issue of this run has been a combination of stamina and fights just taking a considerable amount of time because consistent DPS isn't really possible. But as long as we're patient and we're careful and we're safe, we should be fine. Now, our overworld event for this section is the Wisp in the Tree. Now, I meant to grab Barkskin, but I wound up forgetting which one gives you that, so I grabbed the wrong one. But it's still something to take note of. And then we move on to the next dungeon of our area, the Lament. Now, the Lament is a dungeon that the more I do it, the more annoyed I get with it. Because it's not a boss dungeon, it's a puzzle dungeon, but it's also like just filled with traps. But I grab the key from the elite, do the secret side dungeon that's full of traps, and then do the primary two secrets of the dungeon. So that way we can move on. Now, before we get to the world boss of Yisha, there is one more stop we have to make, and at this point in time, I was really hoping that it wasn't going to be the dungeon that I thought it was, but unfortunately, it winds up being what I thought it was. Oh no, there's still one more. Please don't be Gardens. Please don't be Imperial Gardens. Ah, shit. Okay. Yeah, even in a normal run, the Imperial Gardens is annoying to do. Ever since I first completed the Imperial Gardens, I typically just skip it because Manticore isn't fun to fight, and learning the maze and remembering the puzzle is also very obnoxious. Unfortunately, I don't have the luxury to skip it this time, due to my rules, so this winds up being a very long and boring fight where I just sit around for most of it and hope to get 1 or 2 spear tosses in. On top of the fact that Managora has both Regenerator and Displacer, there was more than one time where I accidentally jumped to my death in this fight, resetting the entire thing. Now, it only took me 3 tries, I think, but overall, this just took me forever. And because of Regenerator, it made it take even longer. Luckily, I did have that Blood Jewel to help reduce the amount of healing he got, but it still was just such a dreadfully long puzzle. But once we do finally manage to take him down, I quickly do the elevator puzzle, and then we're done. I highly dislike the Imperial Gardens. It's so obnoxious. Finally moving on to the final boss of Yisha, we fight the Ravager. Now once again, I do have to choose to fight him rather than join him as per the rules, so we get right into it. Now, the Ravager melee isn't all that much different from the Ravager with ranged because he's always on top of you. This fight is more about just learning when I'm able to attack and when I'm not able to attack, and honestly, it's quite the fun fight. Now the first phase is the same as always, he just runs at you and swipes at you, and then after a certain amount of time you'll summon adds. These adds were actually quite annoying, but I didn't really have another way of dealing with them outside of just being careful and throwing my spears as fast as I could. I did get a little lucky on some of the attempts that I did, where the Ravager would stay far enough away that I could deal with all 3 of them before he would attack me, but that wasn't always the case. But after a lot of damage and a lot of spears, we move on to Phase 2, and Phase 2 is significantly less interesting than Phase 1, solely because I can't stand near him. If I stand near him, I'll die to his scream. So this wound up just being a back and forth of him charging at me, I roll out of the way, get 1 or 2 hits in, then run away to toss spears until he charges at me again. Now, this fight did take a considerable amount of time because he spawned in as Regenerator, and near the end of the fight I decided I wanted to try and throw, but we managed to do just enough damage right before the roar goes off, and we're able to finish Yisha. On to the final planet, Narud. Now, Narud has slowly become my least favorite planet. Not for any particular reason other than that its overworld is very annoying to navigate, its enemies are very obnoxious, and it's just a dreary and boring overworld to look at. A lot of its enemies are just flying enemies in the first part, so it's also just insanely difficult with the spear to effectively take care of groups since it's so slow to toss. So we do our best to just move on as fast as possible, and we make it to our first dungeon, the Hatchery. Now, in this dungeon, there is a secret side room where this orb follows us, but this orb typically isn't that much of a problem. It's very slow and typically gets stuck in certain places, so you're able to pretty much just ignore it as long as you're not too slow. Which means that we're very easily able to complete that and make it to the boss of this dungeon, the Primogenitor. Yeah, this boss still isn't a problem. It's slow, doing anything with the spear is slow and annoying, but I mean, once we take care of the guy he's riding on, we just stab him a bunch. Nothing in this area is really good at damaging us, so yeah, we take him down first try again. Still think this boss needs a little bit more in order to make him actually difficult, but we move on. The Tower of the Unseen is our next stop, and this is also one of those dungeons that's pretty annoying, because it's very long, and at the end is a puzzle. But we just make our way through as fast as possible, complete the puzzle, and just get downstairs as fast as possible. Now, the mini-boss on the bottom floor can be quite difficult, especially since he's got Regenerator and Displacer again. But luckily for us, we're able to keep our distance for the most part, I will admit that I did cheese this guy out with spears a little bit more than I normally would, but that's just because this in particular elite is just obnoxious to deal with on a daily basis. But once the mini-boss is dealt with, we get through the final secret of this dungeon, and then we're off to the Astropath's Respite. Now, the Astropath's Respite is not a particularly difficult area, however, it is quite annoying to deal with the spear because the boss is flying for the most part. He does get pretty close, but never close enough to actually get any decent strikes in. But before we get there, we do have one secret area to deal with, and it's just this secret elite boss that you get to access by touching this purple blob. This boss is not difficult in any way, shape, or form. It's just annoying and honestly quite long because I can't do consistent damage and he runs all over the place. But we do take care of him eventually, and we move on to the Astropath. Now, the Astropath is typically not too hard of a fight, but with no real opportunities to hit him outside of throwing my spear, it makes it significantly more difficult to deal damage, and I wind up needing to actually need a new strategy. Recently, I just beat Hardcore, and that unlocked the ability to use the Daredevil trinket, which is how I came to create this build I like to call the Unkillable Dumbass. Now, the whole goal of this build is to just get as much damage as possible, regardless of if I get one shot or not, because I have so many ways of making sure that I stay alive even if I get hit. And this build lets me do significantly more damage and is actually what helped me win this fight. The main problem with this guy is that it's very difficult to actually deal meaningful damage to him with the spear, on top of the fact that his adds are also very difficult to deal with just in general, because it's difficult to hit them sometimes, and they cause a lot of problems. So eventually, I just have to move on to this glass cannon build. Using this build, we are able to deal enough damage to take care of all of the problems, and as long as we're slow and careful with it, we do eventually kill him once again. Now, the last thing we have to do before we get to the final boss of Narud is going to be the Dormant Nerudian Facility. Luckily, this event isn't too long. As usual, I just typically do the shortcut way of doing it. It's not technically cheating because we still complete the objective and we have to fight a mini-boss. It's just deciding whether or not we want to fight an entire room of stuff or just one boss. So I take the boss. On top of that, I think I broke him somehow, because he spawned with slow puddles, which means he'll just spawn these areas that'll slow you down and make it harder for you to avoid things. But for some reason, that's the only thing he did. Every single time I would hit him, he would then spawn slow puddles. He wouldn't do anything else. He rarely ever attacked me. But a bugged mini-boss means an easy kill for me. I'll take it. With the Dormant Nerudian Facility behind us, we're able to make it to the final boss, the Guardian at Sentinel's Keep. This was another bit of a roadblock. Not only is it a boss that's almost entirely impossible to melee, there are opportunities to melee him. He eventually uses his fists to try and hit you, and you can get some good damage in there. But other than that, you have to hit the orb that he holds. And one major problem were these little balls that he spawns that would, after a short delay, shoot a beam of energy. I didn't have the ability to destroy them all, so I had to just avoid them until they disappeared. And this was not easy, and it took a lot of stamina. But other than that, this fight is fairly straightforward. All you have to do is be careful of the little orbs and choose your moments to attack. It did take us a few attempts because that one attack is just so dreadfully difficult to avoid, and it caused me a lot of problems. But utilizing my strategy of 3 lives, I am able to outlast and eventually take him down. A good thing about this build is that even if I do take damage, typically the cooldowns of my second lives are up before I need to take another point of damage. So it's more like I have 4 or 5 lives, since the cooldown of my Invader ability is only like 60 seconds and the Black Cat Band comes off cooldown every 2 minutes. It's a bit of a cheese strategy, but it's also really fun to use. With Narud out of the way, we finally make it to our final location, Earth, and this area shouldn't be too much of an issue, right? Oh, come on. Right. Well, regardless, we make our way through as fast as possible, and we make it to our first location, the first siege. And if I'm being honest with you, the main problem of these areas is going to be those mantis flowers, just because of how unpredictable and chaotic they can be. Now, melee up until this point has been kinda rough. There are some enemies that just don't care whether or not you're meleeing them, and other enemies are just nearly impossible to melee. But most things in this area are actually very easy to melee, which makes my life significantly easier in that regard. However, there's also just so much stuff to worry about that it winds up overwhelming me quite a few times, especially in this siege moment. On top of the elites being difficult to deal with, it takes us quite a few times, but eventually we do just have to take it slow, and as soon as we get to the knight is easy pickings, considering he's just a weaker version of Venom, and we all know how that goes. With this first siege out of the way, we make our way to our first boss, Cancer. And oh boy, did I enjoy this fight. Now, there are not many bosses in this game that you're able to just wail into, but for some reason, on this particular encounter, Cancer kinda just didn't really do anything other than slam his head down a few times and jump across the arena. We managed to do this boss on our first time, and it was a blast. I don't know what happened or if this boss is just easier to do melee, but using the few tricks that I've learned about rolling towards them, always staying close, we're able to get plenty of attacks in, and there are literally no problems other than a few mistakes that I made on my end, and we take him down without too much of an issue. This was honestly one of my favorite fights this entire run. Now this next section is quite obnoxious, with it being a long stretch between this point and the next point of just really tough elites and swarms of enemies. On top of the fact that I only have a spear, means that it actually is quite difficult. On top of the fact that for some reason the screech from the striders was just insta-downing me for some reason, which was something I've never encountered before. They wouldn't kill me, but they would take my second life away. So my challenger trait was constantly being put on cooldown for whatever reason, and I'm just really confused as to why that was happening. I don't know if it's stamina related or what, but eventually I just get pissed and just charge at them, which works. So we're able to move on. But if anybody knows what's going on with this little thing, please let me know, because it really baffled me and made this area so much more difficult than it should have been. But with us able to finally make it to the end of this stretch, we make our way to the next siege survival. And this one isn't as bad as the first one. It never is, because you're able to use the stairs as a choke point. It's a little more difficult with the spear, however the idea is the same, and we're able to section off one elite from the other so we don't have to deal with both at the same time, and we're able to eliminate them both. It does take me one try longer than normal, but it's still not too difficult, and we're able to move on. Now the final obstacle between us and Annihilation is Venom, who's honestly not that difficult to melee. The problem is that most of his body is an armor point, and it's very difficult to actually aim with your melee to not hit these armor points, meaning that any damage we deal is most of the time being reduced significantly. On top of the fact that, once again, our long charge-up time with the spear means that it's actually fairly difficult to get any meaningful damage off on his weak spot, and the constant pressure means that we have to be very careful when we actually attack. This winds up dragging on to be quite the long fight, where one mistake means our death. Now, with the AoE fields, I decided to switch back to my previous build, where I had a bit of more bulkiness to me. I still get one-shot by any of his main attacks, however the AoEs wind up not killing me instantaneously anymore, which gives me a bit more wiggle room. Now this boss could have been significantly more difficult than he actually was. Luckily for me, his two traits he spawned with weren't too problematic. Empathy is annoying, but it's not the end of the world. All that means is that we can't get hit, we can't heal. It winds up not being too much of a problem, and after being slow and steady and being very careful, we eventually do whittle him down, even if it does take quite a considerable amount of time. Once again, we are here. The end. Annihilation. The final boss of Remnant 2. Now, if I'm being entirely honest with you, I got extremely lucky most of this run. With the Drakestone Pearl, the Daredevil's Talisman, the Charged Blood Ring, all of it leading up to the ability to actually have all the tools necessary to get through this fight. Now, Our first couple of attempts are once again just learning our opportunities to attack, what we can and can't do. Being too greedy with our attacks leads us to dying. Other than that, this boss doesn't change too much. He's a flying boss, which means that any actual melees doesn't actually happen. Even in his second phase, there are no opportunities to really melee this guy effectively. Which leads us to just this being a very drawn out long fight where we have to balance between dodging and our stamina. And luckily for us, the blood jewel is very important here since he spawned as Regenerator. With the bleed constantly applied to him, he doesn't regenerate nearly as much as he originally would, making this a significantly easier fight. With the blood jewel solving one major problem we would have with this boss, the next problem is the orbs that he summons. Now, typically you're supposed to destroy these so that way you can stun the boss, but unfortunately for the most part, I'll be lucky to kill 2 pairs, maybe even all 3 in the main phase, but in his second phase when he summons a ton of them, our best bet is to activate our secondary ability and kill as many as possible. We might get lucky and be able to kill most of them, but most of the time there's going to be 1 or 2 pairs left, and you're going to have to learn how to dodge those. They weren't as much of a problem as I thought. We just had to be ready for when they spawned, that way we could deal with them appropriately. Other than that, the fight is pretty much normal. Pacing out your attacks, be ready for the orbs, keep the bleed constantly applied to him, and you will eventually be able to whittle him down and take him out. This was quite the fun fight. I would argue to say that this was easier than the hunting rifle, solely because we did actually deal some decent damage at this point in time since we have an actual build going. But it still was quite the challenge, it took quite a considerable amount of time, and the third phase when you kill him and you have to survive was actually pretty scary considering I don't know what happens if you actually die during that phase. I don't know if it resets you, but I didn't want to find out. I got very close to dying, but luckily right before I did go down, the phase ended and we were victorious. And with that, we can officially know that it is entirely possible to beat Remnant 2 with only melee. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Adios, boys.